Hello, hello, students. So today we're going to begin looking at the sense organs. Um, Quick review. You may recall from our last unit, we talked about if you are thrown a tennis ball, there's these three pieces that are involved. First, you have to see the tennis ball coming at you. Then you have to think about what you're going to do. And then you have to actually stimulate your bones and muscles to actually catch the ball or dodge or do whatever it is you're going to do. So in our last unit, we really focused on integration. We talked about the brain and what the different parts of the brain are and what those different parts do. Um, And then we looked at how signals are sent through the nervous system via action potentials and neurotransmitters to kind of zip up and down these nerves to move the signal around. So let's just take a moment to see how well you learn those parts of the brain. These are kind of tricky, but take a moment, hit pause, and try to answer these questions to the best of your ability based on what you've already learned. So hit pause, do it. You ready? Boom, here we go. Here's the answers. Um, yeah, take a look and then, check your notes and hopefully these answers make sense to you. So at this point, we're going to back up in this flow chart and we're going to look a little bit more at that sensory input piece. How is it that our senses are able to take in this information? If you think about it, it's quite extraordinary, right? Light waves bouncing off a tennis ball are somehow entering your eyeball, and your brain is then able to kind of make sense of that tennis ball, the color, the texture, the size, the shape, all that information just from light waves bouncing off it. It's pretty incredible. So that's what we're going to look at. How does that happen? So to begin, let's just kind of zoom out and ask, how many senses are there? And since I'm staring at a screen, there's no one to shout out the answer, but the answer I usually get are five. And I say, okay, what are the five? And then you shout them out. And the real challenge is you have to shout them out in the order that they appear in this slideshow. But here they are. They are sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And anyone who's ever watched The Magic School Bus or read the books, is familiar with these. But what if I told you that that is not the entire truth? There are actually not just five senses. There are myriad senses. Myriad being a word that means many. What do you mean by that? How can there be more than five, Mr. Sanger? That doesn't seem right. Well, look at this lady. She's kind of balancing on a ball. And if you picture yourself balancing on that, you would know that as you kind of tilt to one end or the other, you would realize, hey, I'm off balance. So how is it that you're aware that you're off balance? It's not touch, it's not sight. Like, what is it? Well, it's something called proprioception. You have the ability, your muscles, I should say, have the ability to kind of detect their orientation in space. So if someone came and took your arm and like bent it, you would know my arm is bent, even if your eyes were closed, and that's because of this sense. Another one, blood pressure. You actually have the ability to detect your own blood pressure. You do it all the time. In fact, constantly, 100%, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You just don't realize this because you're not doing it consciously, subconsciously. And there's a part of your brain that gets that information. Hopefully, you know it's the basic physiological part of your brain, brainstem. Got it. So the brainstem is taking that information and then making adjustments in the body to maintain an appropriate blood pressure. So you're detecting your blood pressure. Same with the blood pH. You are continually monitoring the pH of your blood, and then your body is adjusting to keep it in balance. So these are just a few examples, but you are continually monitoring not just the world around you, but also your internal environment. And in this unit, we're going to mostly focus on the big five from the Magic School Bus, but later in the course, we'll talk a little bit more about how we detect blood pressure and some of these other ones. So let's take a look. The key idea to understanding senses, and this is a really important concept that kids always, it's just, I don't know, if like floats by them. I don't know if people tune out at this point or what, but like really zoom in here. Key idea. At the root of all of your senses are these special cells called sensory receptors. And these are nerve cells, and their job is to convert the energy of some stimulus into an action potential. And you can see stimulus is causing them to fire an action potential. Um, Think of this like a Spanish to English dictionary. These cells speak two languages. They speak the language of the stimulus and they speak the language of the nervous system, which is action potential. So if the right stimulus hits them, they're able to convert that into an action potential that sends a signal to your brain. And then it's your brain that actually makes sense of that and creates the perception that you experience. And the creation of that perception is no one really truly understands how little nerve signals buzzing around my head creates this image of a tennis ball. That's pretty incredible. But these are the cells that get the information there. So these are at the root of all of them. Examples of sensoreceptor, there's a handful that we're going to be focusing on in this class. So the first type are chemoreceptors, and as you might expect, they're stimulated by chemicals or specific molecules. So the taste buds on your tongue, what are called olfactory cells in your nose, both of which we're going to talk about more very soon. These are chemoreceptors, so a very specific molecule binds to them, they send an action potential, and your brain makes sense of that information. CO2 sensors in your blood are chemoreceptors, and this is how you monitor your blood pH. So you have little chemoreceptors in certain parts of your circulatory system that then send information to your brainstem that says, here's what the CO2 levels and therefore pH of your blood are. Photoreceptors are another type. These are stimulated by a specific wavelength of light. And you've probably heard of the rods and cones of your eye. Here is the back of your eyeball, and these cells in this back layer are the rods and cones, so named because, hey, these yellow ones look like rods, and these blue ones kind of look like cones. Gosh, thank you, gods of naming. There are mechanoreceptors. These are stimulated by or by physical movement. So there's these little hair cells in your ears. Here's a picture of them. And if they're moved, then they will trigger an action potential that your body picks up. So another example of this, remember proprioception, that woman balancing on the ball. That sense has its origins here in your muscles. There are what are called stretch receptors. And if you flex your muscle or bend your muscle, then those little receptors are physically moved and sends a signal to your brain that says, hey, your arm muscle has been bent. Blood pressure, you monitor that with these stretch receptors as well. They're in your blood vessels. And if there's a lot of blood in your blood vessels, the pressure is high, those stretch receptors are like, whoa, there's a lot of blood here. And then that sends a signal to your brain that says, hey, high blood pressure. And if those stretch receptors kind of constrict, then there isn't as much pressure and sends a signal to your brain accordingly. So again, we're going to be zooming in on these traditional 5 senses in this course, and we're going to sort of do them in we're going to start with the boring one, touch. Touch isn't boring. It's actually quite an important sense, but it's a little less interesting than sight, for example. Anyway, so the key idea here is that there are various sensory receptors in the skin that respond to various types of stimulus. So there are nerves that will fire an action potential if they are stimulated by heat or cold, light touch, deep high pressure touch. Different kinds of stimulus will trigger different ones of these cell types, and then they convert that into an action potential, and then that signal goes to the brain to make sense of it. Now, we learned last unit, there's a part of your brain that is responsible for processing these touch signals, and I'm hoping you remember what it is. It's that little band. It's part of the parietal lobe. Did you say somatosensory cortex? The thalamus, as you may recall, is a relay station for senses. And so once these touch receptors are stimulated, they send an action potential, which ultimately reaches the thalamus. And then your thalamus sends that signal to the parietal lobe, and more specifically, the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe, that red band. And then that is the area that makes sense and creates that perception. So it's the somatosensory cortex. So basically to process touch, it goes to the thalamus and then the somatosensory cortex. So I think I'm going to pause there, and then with our next screencast, we will look at taste and smell.